What's up, everyone? So, in this video, I'm going to talk about unemployment, and I'm going to do this in hopefully something closer to like podcast format, where my expectation is probably you're listening to this in the background rather than necessarily watching what I'll put up on the screen. Though I'll certainly show some resources and some government sites where we can look at the unemployment data and make sense out of it, incidental to as I go through this here. So, unemployment rate is an important macroeconomic variable that economists can use to get a pretty good sense of what's happening in the economy at the present time. It's useful for making comparisons across time and then across regions. One of the reasons why economists really like using the unemployment rate, and one of the reasons why you hear this from the central bank, from the Federal Reserve, as one of the measures that they're looking for when they're deciding whether or not to raise and lower interest rates, apart from the fact that maintaining full employment is part of the Fed's mandate, is the fact that relative to our other measures, our other economic indicators, unemployment is maybe a little bit more intimate in that it directly impacts or it shows the direct impact on households and individuals, right? So, like, real GDP is a measure of the market value of all final goods produced and services produced within a time period in an economic unit. Other things equal, when GDP rises, that's good. Other things equal, when GDP falls, that's bad. But the impact on everyday individuals is a little bit more indirect. Same thing with inflation, right? So if there's inflation, prices are rising. Well, that's not good for individuals or households. But on the other hand, that's not a direct impact, right? So, like, sure, yeah, you go to the store, you see prices generally are rising, you're directly going to be impacted. But when we look at the measure, when economists look at the number, the inflation rate, we don't necessarily see the direct impact on people. Whereas with the unemployment rate, that's literally representing people who have lost a job or would like to work and can't, right? And so the unemployment rate is a measure that maybe does a little bit closer job of indicating directly how people are being affected. And so for that reason, it's maybe a little bit more powerful. Also, the unemployment rate is correlated in important ways with some of those other things. So we know the unemployment rate ought to be, and this is a pretty robust, I mean, by definition, finding, the unemployment rate is going to be inversely correlated with real GDP under normal circumstances, right? Real GDP is economic output. As we're producing more economic value, the labor of more and more people is necessary to be producing that economic activity, right? So real GDP is a measure of the economic activity, the economic value that's being created by an economy that involves people, which involves them working. And so as the economy expands, as real GDP rises, we expect unemployment's going to be falling. Actually, fewer and fewer people are going to be unemployed, and fewer other capital resources are going to be left idle. When GDP falls, we expect unemployment is going to be rising. There's going to be less economic activity. Therefore, there's fewer individuals whose labor is needed to be able to produce that now diminished economic activity. There's also often an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. That's the Phillips curve relationship. Now, that holds a lot of times, though it's not maybe quite as robust as the statement I just made between unemployment and real GDP. So, in particular, during periods of stagflation, you can get rising inflation and rising unemployment. That's literally the definition of stagflation, right? And so, anyway, that relationship, the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment, can more often fail to hold. The inverse relationship between the unemployment rate and real GDP should almost always hold. Okay, so unemployment is a measure, and it's one of the way that people discuss it is one of many measures related to measuring unemployment. And so what I'm referring to is there's a whole collection of what we might call alternative measures of labor underutilization. Actually, if you type into your favorite browser that exact phrase, alternative measure of labor underutilization, like for states, for instance, you'll be brought to the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. It's the Bureau of Labor Statistics that measures the unemployment rate. If you click through their site, I've got it here. I'll just read through it for those not seeing the screen. There's 6 measures for at the state level for unemployment. There's U1, U2, U3, U4, U5, U6. The headline unemployment, the main one, the one that we see in textbooks as the definition, and the one that gets reported in the media is U3. So that's the total unemployed as a percent of the civilian labor force, which is the definition used for the official unemployment rate. The way that this is defined, so it's the total unemployed as a percent of the civilian labor force, requires further description of what we mean by civilian labor force. So generally what this is taken to mean is you have to be 16 years old and older, you have to be non-institutionalized and civilian, right? And you have to have looked for a job unsuccessfully within the last 30 days to be considered unemployed. Can't be part of the military because unemployment by definition in the military is going to be zero. So we're looking at civilian labor force. Now the other measures of unemployment, the U1 measure is just persons unemployed 15 weeks or longer as a percent of civilian labor force. U2 is job losers and persons who have completed temporary jobs as a percentage of civilian labor force. U4 is total unemployed plus discouraged workers as a percent of the civilian labor force plus discouraged workers. Discouraged workers are those who had been looking for a job but then quit. Like they stopped looking for a job because they haven't been finding one. U5 is total unemployed plus discouraged workers plus other marginally attached workers as a percentage of civilian labor force plus all marginally attached workers. Marginally attached, so these are, I forget exactly the precise definition, but these are people who will work occasionally. Maybe this is even like seasonal workers. U6, total unemployed plus all marginally attached workers plus employed part-time for economic reasons as a percentage of civilian labor force plus all marginally attached workers. U6 includes those employed part-time for economic reasons. So these are people who would rather be working full-time. Now, from my perspective, I like looking at the U3 measure, that's the textbook definition, and the U6 measure in conjunction to get a wider window into what's actually happening. Officially, like if I'm really interested, I also want to pay attention to what's happened to the number of people employed. To do this, what I'll do is I'll look up the recent release of the employment situation. You could literally just type that into your favorite search engine, find the employment situation. The most recent, as the time of me making this video in January 2026, is the employment situation from December 2025. And if you bring this up, it'll come in PDF form. It's produced by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and you can find actually the data from their surveys. So it's got all the definitions for how they're defining them, and then it'll give you a collection of the data across the different criteria that they're looking at. And this will basically give you the data that many economists are looking at to make their assessment of unemployment. The employment situation will report two different surveys, the household survey and the establishment survey. You can read through the employment situation if you care or if you're interested in more detail. But basically what happens is the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys a large sample of either households, so these are individuals reporting about like their own employment status, or at the establishment level, these are firms. And then from this survey, through the statistical techniques, they're able to come up with the percentage from survey respondents, and then with some degree of confidence, extrapolate this to the larger economy as a whole with whatever is the margin of error. And so you learn actually kind of how to do that if you take an econometrics class. It's a kind of interesting empirical exercise. But for now, we don't need to worry so much about that, other than I'll mention that that's where the unemployment rate's actually coming from. So unemployment is not a perfect measure. There is maybe issues with non-response in these surveys, or people failing to take the surveys really seriously, or whatever. And so they talk about that in the employment situation and measure some of the difficulties inherent in measuring these data. But economists are relatively convinced we've got pretty robust data, pretty good data. Even so, the unemployment rate's still an imperfect measure of joblessness because people might call themselves unemployed, but actually not want to work at all, right? Or maybe they have searched for a job to meet the basic criteria of being considered unemployed and maybe for benefits or whatever, but they actually didn't look too hard. They weren't searching that much for a job. This wasn't a major priority for them or whatever. So there's that degree of like difficulty in estimating the true underlying unemployment rate. The fact is, in the US anyway, and over the past several decades, when people become unemployed, they're able to find work relatively quickly, right? So even so, any level of unemployment is notable, especially if this rises. And what economists are really interested in when you're trying to think about trends and patterns is the difference between short-term and longer-term unemployment. And so when we start to see rises in the longer-term unemployment rate, this gets really concerning because you realize people have been searching for jobs and have been just routinely unsuccessful. And so that's more concerning and more suggestive of like deeper economic problems if you see long-term unemployment rising. So there's a variety of why there might be unemployment in the economy in the first place. One thing is, well, it's just natural and healthy for there to be some transition in the economy over time. This goes back to the idea that, well, there's this creative engine of new jobs coming into the economy to replace past industries or whatever. There's this adjustment period. Hopefully, people are able to find a new job to employ their skills relatively quickly. If that's true, then they're probably in the category of like frictional unemployment. There's three categories of unemployment: frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and then cyclical unemployment. Frictional unemployment is not concerning at all. This is people with short-term spells of unemployment. They've left one job, they seek another. Maybe they get fired. Well, that's not great for them, but hopefully they're able to find another job relatively quick. Or maybe they're in transition between one job. They know the next one's going to be starting before too long, or they're career changers or something like that, right? So there's frictional unemployment that's maybe most impacted by the search costs and maybe like the general economic activity within a economy to see like how robust is their hiring at the moment. Structural unemployment is a more severe issue. So this is a mismatch between the jobs that are being offered within a local economy and the skills that workers have available. So this could be really concerning in the case of if there's a major employer or a plant or a factory that shuts down. All of a sudden you've got massive structural unemployment in that area because you have all these workers who are displaced. They specialize, they've got skills that were really good at working whatever was their present job, which no longer exists. So now they've got a decision to make. Do we hope another factory comes and opens up in that area? Do we move? Do you try to obtain other skills or invest in education to be able to like retrain? And that can have generational effects. And so so structural unemployment is another cause of unemployment. But it's for these reasons, frictional unemployment and structural unemployment, that we expect there's always going to be some degree of unemployment in an economy because these things are natural and they do happen over time. Yeah, there's different types of policies that policymakers could try to enact to try to mitigate or limit the amount of structural unemployment in a particular area. Not a lot you can do about frictional unemployment, but these are not the types of things that the federal government or that governments are really getting involved in from the standpoint of like trying to address pressing economic phenomena. The type of unemployment that gets typically addressed in the sense of like government increasing government spending or stimulus checks or the Federal Reserve getting involved by adjusting interest rates is cyclical unemployment. So cyclical unemployment refers to unemployment due to basically the business cycle. So a recession, right? And so if there's unemployment because of cyclical unemployment, because of a recession, this is going to be the excess unemployment above and beyond what economists would consider to be the natural unemployment rate. The natural unemployment rate for an economy is going to be the sum of the frictional unemployment rate and the structural unemployment rate. It's basically characterized by the absence of cyclical unemployment. And so what we might call the full employment unemployment rate, or the full employment equilibrium unemployment rate, is not zero. It's the level of frictional plus structural unemployment, but it's characterized by the absence of cyclical unemployment. Anyway, there's some other reasons why there's like perennially going to be some level of unemployment in an economy. So one reason is, well, there's search costs. It takes time for workers to find a job. The generosity of unemployment benefits can affect this the search process. So you need like some level of unemployment benefits because people have lost a job, they lost their source of income, their bills don't go away, so they need something to be able to get them through to when they're able to work again. If unemployment benefits are really generous, then this diminishes the incentive for workers to seek out new employment. That is often cited as one of the key differences between unemployment rates in the United States versus Europe. And so Europe has traditionally more generous unemployment insurance and unemployment policies. And so they tend to have more structural unemployment and more longer term unemployment than in the United States. Although that's an empirical question, right? So we can collect facts or collect data and see if those facts are still true at any given time. Also, I think other things equal, from my perspective anyway, as economists, is I think we want sufficiently generous unemployment benefits so that workers who lose their job, especially unexpectedly, are able to take time to find a job that's going to be efficiently suiting their skill set and their future aspirations. I think it's bad if people have to scramble to take their first available job, because I think that leads to some types of mismatches. And so maybe that person's not going to be maybe as productive, certainly way less happy in their new position if they just like grab the first thing that was available, versus if they're able to take a little time to gather their thoughts and focus on finding something that's going to be a better use of their time and efforts and energy. I think from the perspective of the long run, that's what an economy should be striving for, long run growth. Okay, second reason why the economy is always going to have some degree of unemployment could potentially be, or is often cited, minimum wage laws. And so minimum wage laws, if they're going to have any impact, are set above the equilibrium wage for that type of labor. And so the idea is this is now a price floor. Price can't go below that level. And at that point, just by definition, the quantity of labor demanded is going to be smaller than the quantity of labor supplied. Right? So there's more people offering their services than firms that are willing to hire them at that price anyway. And so then you have a mismatch, you have a surplus, and that labor surplus is called unemployment. So that's potentially going to have different effects across different regions. I think from my perspective, it's best to think of the impact of minimum wage laws as a case-by-case kind of regional question. But anyway, economic theory certainly predicts that minimum wage laws are going to contribute some degree of unemployment. Let's see. Third reason for unemployment is the market power potentially of unions. So if unions push wages and unionize industries above the equilibrium level, creates a surplus of labor. On the other hand, to the extent that the union is successful, they're able to create higher salaries, benefits for their workers. And so there's a trade-off. Good if you're part of the union, not good if you're not part of the union. And the idea is like, well, with all things, there's no such thing as a free lunch, meaning that there's going to be trade-offs. And so, unions are going to be successful in potentially raising the salary, raising the benefits for their workers. The trade-off is this could invite maybe higher than otherwise levels of unemployment. But then the argument is, well, they've created jobs that are worth having versus jobs that are not. And so it's interesting anyway. A fourth reason for unemployment is suggested by the theory of efficiency wages. According to this theory, firms find it profitable to pay wages above the equilibrium level. Higher wages can improve worker health, reduce worker turnover, raise worker quality, increase worker effort, boost worker morale. So what's an efficiency wage? An efficiency wage is an above equilibrium wage. So this is one of the things that adds a little bit of nuance back to the discussion of like minimum wage laws and even unions. Is the idea is actually some firms will find it beneficial to voluntarily pay an above equilibrium wage, like to pay a pretty generous wage relative to what other employers might be offering. You can think of a wide variety of stories of why that might be true. Certainly not every business does this, but those that do have a good reason for it. The idea is, firstly, if you are paying an above equilibrium wage, you're going to stand out relative to rivals for this scarce worker pool. And the idea is, as a result, you're able to attract possibly the most productive workers, because the most productive workers are going to compete with each other to get the best jobs. And so maybe by paying a higher wage, you're able to attract better workers. Certainly by paying a higher wage, you're able to retain higher or better workers. So the idea is those workers realize if they're being paid an above equilibrium wage, if they were to become unemployed, it'd be very difficult for them to match that same income level, right? They're going to be working maybe a worse job for worse pay, and so they don't want to get fired. They're going to work hard, they're going to do a good job. And the last thing, from the behavioral economics perspective, there might be a level of gift exchange wherein a worker who's being paid an above equilibrium wage, if they realize that their employer is paying wages more generous than similar employers in the area, they might feel more valued and therefore want to, this is like the boost worker morale. They might take more pride in their own work. They might want to be more productive. They might want to feel more invested. Whatever like behavioral or psychological story you want to tell basically comes down to the idea they want to do a better job. And so for all these reasons, it can be beneficial for firms to pay above equilibrium wages. Okay, so I just finished off like the lecture notes right there, kind of implicitly as I'm going through this. But I wanted to mention also, similarly as I've mentioned in other videos, when you're going through a macroeconomics course, it's worthwhile to go and see the actual current data. And so when I was mentioning those alternative measures of labor underutilization, if you went to that site, if you literally like Googled or whatever, alternative measures of labor underutilization by state, you'll find this table. It'll have all the US states, and it'll have a table that gives their U1, U2, U3, U4, U5, U6 measures. At the very end, it'll give the measures for two selected areas, Los Angeles County and then New York City, which is also useful in comparison. But anyway, I think this is interesting because this will give you a state level comparison across those 6 measures of the unemployment rate. Also, if you go to St. Louis Fed, go to St. Louis Fed site, you can find their data depicted in table form or in graph form, usually in graph form. So for instance, I go to St. Louis Fed U6 unemployment rate, and it'll give me a graph of the U6 unemployment rate. And the really interesting thing that you can do with this is you can look and see on the table or on the graph how the U6 unemployment rate moves and when it returns to, for instance, pre-recession levels. So what I'm going to do, if you're not watching, is I've got the graph up, and on the graph there's going to be these. There's the unemployment rate itself, the U6 measure. It's on the graph in blue, but then there's these vertical gray bands that corresponds to recessions. And so if I go to the gray band corresponding to the Great Recession, to the financial crisis, and I go back to, let's see, the unemployment rate, from, I've got the U3 measure, so I'll have to go to the U6 measure in a second. Let me look at the U3 measure from November of 2007. It was 4.7. It rose to 9.5 by July 2009. It peaked actually a little bit beyond where the official recession is indicated on this table in October 2009 at 10%. And then it trended, well, it went up and down, up and down, up and down, and then eventually came down. When did it get back to 4.7? Well, it got back below 4.7%, December of 2016. If I'm looking at this, there's some places where I got a little bit closer between then. But anyway, according to this, well, the recession was basically, the unemployment rate had basically returned to normal by 2016. Then, of course, there's unemployment rate fell, rose again drastically in 2020, and then fell again for for other reasons. But anyway, if you look at that in conjunction with the U6 unemployment rate, I think I missed that here. So let's see. Yeah, I was looking for the U6 unemployment rate. If you look for the U6 unemployment rate, U6 was in November 2007, 8.5. And it rose up to, well, in the time that I quoted, October 2009, at 17.1%. Right, this is U6. This is a really coarse measure of unemployment. When did it fall back down to 8.5? Well, it didn't fall down to 8.5 in 2016. To get to 8.5 took all the way out to May 2017, right? So several months later. And so economists would look at this and say something about the kind of lagged effects and how long it actually took for the economy to return back to maybe a baseline or to a pre-recession level. And if you're looking just at the U3 number, you might suggest that it had returned to normal far sooner than it actually had if you're looking at the U6 measure. Similarly, for other interesting economic phenomena, like for 2020, let's see, in February of 2020, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. In, let's see, July 2022, it was 3.5%. What does the U6 measure tell us? U6 measure tells us in January 2020, it was 7%. And then when did it go back to 7%? Well, not until March 2022. That was a little bit closer. Well, the fundamental reasons for that recession were different than the Great Recession. And so you could see maybe a much more rapid revision back to normal, or sort of recovery from the more recent recession, at least looking at comparing the U3 measure versus U6 measure of unemployment. Anyway, I'll go ahead, I'll conclude here. Hope you enjoyed this video, hope you found it useful, and I'll see you in the next one.